Welcome to the Apocrypha Apocalypse. It's me, David, again, and we're gonna continue with our topic. Did councils contradict each other on the canonicity of the book of Esdras, and whether the North African councils recognize this book as a separate canonical book? So, last time we dwelt into the basics, the descriptions of these books, the beginning of these theories, and we have shown that the manuscript evidence is too variable to make a decision and make a connection between manuscripts and the North African councils. Now, in this part, I would like to look into the church fathers, how they utilized the Greek Esdras, and I'm going to look into the usage, quotations, and how they enumerated the books of Esdras. And we are going to look at the canonical lists as well. So first, let's look at the quotations. I'm not going to look into separate quotations. We have this fantastic book by Denter, this is basically his dissertation, and he examined a lot of quotations, and here's just the summary. So these are the quotations by the Greek fathers from the Greek Esdras. So this is the 1st century, 2nd century, and so on. And look at this. So we have 4th, 5th century, and it starts to decrease slowly, but it is decreasing. But what is even more important is the quotations made by the Latin fathers, because the North African councils are in the Latin West, right? So they would be at least binding for them. And look at this. Yeah, the 3rd century, 4th century, 5th century, and a rapid drop to 0. In the 6th, 7th, 8th century, no more quotations from Greek Esdras by the Latin fathers. How so? We have to ask this question. What happened? What influenced this decision? Now, certainly this cannot be the influence of the Vulgate, because the Vulgate would start to prevail maybe in the 7th century, 8th, not in the 6th, that's too early. They would still use a lot the Old Latin. So this is very significant, this huge drop of citations between the 5th and 6th century. The same chart can be seen in Canessa's work. So as you can see, there's a slow decrease of quotations from Greek Esdras in the Greek fathers, and in the Latin fathers it drops to 0 in the 6th century. Now, even though there are lots of allusions and quotations, Hanhart would argue that only a few excerpts from the writings of Greek church fathers such as Eusebius, Cyril of Alexandria, and Theodoret are textually significant in the context of the history of the text. Now, the question is, are there any quotations from the Hebrew Ezra? Well, if we look at the Latin West, there are in the 5th century, according to Denter, not sooner or earlier. But this is made solely, these are from Jerome. In the Greek East, there might be some quotations from the Hebrew Ezra, but we cannot be certain, because these quotations or allusions might be also from the Greek Esdras or from Ezra. We cannot decide, so difficult to tell. Nevertheless, today we know that Denter was wrong, that there were no citations from the Hebrew Ezra before the 5th century, because Timotheus, Wooden, I think they would confirm that we have a clear reference from the Hebrew Ezra made by Eusebius of Caesarea in his commentary on Isaiah. And here it is. This is the English translation. So clearly Eusebius here used Ezra instead of the Greek Esdras. So both Beckwith and Denter are wrong that Ezra wasn't quoted at all. But the question is, why do they prefer the Greek Esdras? Why is this huge preference of quotations from the Greek Esdras instead of the Ezra Nehemiah? Well, if you recall my previous presentation, we talked about the language and linguistic features, that the Greek Esdras is an elegant, harmonious, and consistent paraphrastic text, while Ezra Nehemiah is a very servile, literal translation. And actually, this led scholars like Ernest or Timothy Young believe that this preference is due to the polished Greek text of First Esdras. And yeah, I think that's reasonable to say, because why would you read, quote, use a translation that is a rigid translation? It's really difficult to use, difficult to read. Certainly, you would rather grab a much easier book to read or easier translation, which would be the Greek Esdras. So that makes perfect sense that the fathers would prefer the Greek Esdras rather than the Ezra and Nehemiah. So quotations, I don't think if really Greek Esdras and Ezra are simply two variants of the same book, then the quotations don't show that they regarded it as a different book and preferred it because it's canonical. We cannot arrive at this conclusion, I think. Now let's look at how did the church fathers label or enumerate the books of Esdras. We have Origen, where in his commentary on the Gospel of St. Matthew, he labels Nehemiah as second Ezra. So he quotes Nehemiah and he introduces it even twice as coming from the second book of Ezra. Now, of course, this might be the book of Nehemiah, or it might be the combined book of Ezra and Nehemiah, and he is just quoting the Nehemiah portion of this combined book. So this won't decide the matter. We have Ambrose, who in his De Spiritu Sancto, second book, is quoting a portion from 4th Esdra, so in the KJV it would be 2nd Esdras, in the Vulgate it would be 4th Ezra, and he's quoting 4th Ezra chapter 6 verse 41 as coming from the 3rd book of Ezra. Further, we have a work called Liber de Divini Scripturis, and while it's attributed to Augustine, scholars acknowledge this is pseudonymous, and it wasn't written by Augustine. Nevertheless, the author quotes first Esdras, and in particular the extra canonical part, and quotes it as coming from the first book of Esdras. And Jerome's gonna be the one who will decide the matter, and specifically his prologue on the book of Ezra. This is what he says: "It is the 3rd year that you always write and write again, that I might translate the book of Ezra for you from the Hebrew, as though you do not have the Greek and Latin scrolls, or whatever it is it is which is translated by us might not be something immediately spat upon by all. No one ought to be bothered by the fact that my edition consists of only one book, nor ought anyone take delight in the dreams found in the apocryphal third and fourth books. For among the Hebrews, the texts of Ezra and Nehemiah are united into a single book, and those texts which are not used by them are not concerned with the 24 elders ought to be rejected outright. But if anyone should oppose you on the basis of the Septuagint translation, whose very variety of text indicates that its copies are corrupt and damaged, nor it can be by any means be claimed that what is diverse is true. Several things to notice here. First, Jerome was requested to translate Ezra from the Hebrew. Now, apparently, those who wanted Jerome to make his translation from the Hebrew knew that Jerome is going to omit the Greek Esdras and omit the extra-canonical text, because through Origen's hexapla, people knew what the Hebrews accepted. The hexapla was very, very known, not only in the East, but also in the West. So through this work, they would anticipate that Jerome is going to omit the Greek Esdras, yet Jerome was requested to translate Ezra from the Hebrew, not from the Septuagint. Second thing I would like to emphasize, that Jerome mentions that the Hebrews have the texts of Ezra and Nehemiah united into a single book. Okay? Further, he says that the third and fourth are apocryphal books. He calls them dreams. And by the way, when he says that the Ezra and Nehemiah are united into a single book, he uses the word koarto, which means press together, compress, contract, confine. So clearly it means that two texts are united into one, but that means that among the Christians, Ezra and Nehemiah are separate texts, separate works. Therefore, first and second Ezras would be Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, as I said, I'm going to engage more or less with Boget. And he says, Jerome also specifies that in Hebrew, the words of Esdras and Nehemiah make up one book. In other words, he knows two books about Esdras and Nehemiah. And later he goes on to say that the division is a later invention. So in the early church, these books were not divided. And he argues that basically the Greek Esdras is a variant of Ezra and Nehemiah, which is very, very far-fetched. As we have seen, Nehemiah comprises only 5% from the whole Greek Esdras. Even more verses are from Second Chronicles than from Nehemiah. Why would one call the Greek Esdras a variant of Ezra and Nehemiah? That's nonsensical. It's much better to call it a variant of Ezra Chronicles. But the most precise rendering is that it's simply a version of Ezra with some additional material, canonical and extra-canonical material. So I think Boget is very, very making far-fetched claims here. Further, he says, Jerome emphasizes the variety of the Septuagint, which refers to the differences between Esdras A and Esdras B. I would absolutely disagree here. So he's making a connection between Jerome's claims about the books of Esdras and the variety of the text of the Septuagint. No, simply Jerome is making the claim that the Hebrew, so his translation, should be accepted because the Hebrew has no varieties. While the Septuagint, in the Septuagint you have many different textual variants, versions, but not necessarily different books. And to show how wrong Bogaert is, for example, in his preface to Joshua, he says, especially when among the Latins there are as many versions as there are books. So again, it's not, Jerome is not talking about that there are different books of Joshua. He simply says that there are different texts with different textual variances, and therefore he says the Septuagint is corrupted and damaged, and not that Joshua, we have Joshua A, Joshua B, first Joshua, second Joshua. No, it just says that there are different texts of Joshua. Same way Augustine says that there are endless diversity of the Latin translators. Okay, different texts, not different books. So to summarize, Origen gives us second Esdras as Nehemiah or Ezra Nehemiah, we don't know. Third Esdras is mentioned by Ambrose, and he quotes fourth Ezra. Then we have Pseudo-Augustine, and first Esdras is mentioned, and Greek Esdras is quoted. And then we have Jerome, who labels the third and fourth as apocryphal works, and says that Ezra Nehemiah, the Hebrew Ezra Nehemiah are divided into two books, and later on he says third and fourth. So Ezra is first, Nehemiah is fourth. So when we combine all these, I think this is the summary. So first Esdras can be viewed as Ezra or Greek Esdras, two variants, two versions of the same book. Second Esdras is Nehemiah, and then we have fourth Ezra, and Bogaert's hypothesis is that fourth Esdras is fifth Ezra and sixth Ezra in one. I don't know, difficult to say, but I think this one is certainly correct. And this would also correspond to what we see in the Syro-Hexapla. Now, further, the reason why the Septuagint is so emphasized when it comes to the North African councils is because special apologists will claim that the Septuagint was the text, the authentic text that was used, quoted, nothing else. Well, is that true? Well, it's not, because Jerome clearly says that Daniel is read in the version of Theodotion, not in the version of the Septuagint. So clearly, this Septuagint was not the only text to go to, or some kind of authoritative text. Theodotion's version of Daniel was clearly more authoritative than the Septuagint version. So we have at least one example. But and the same thing is made in the prologue to Ezra by Jerome, who says that the Greeks, who after the 70 translators with the gospel of Christ now shining, they both attentively read the Jewish and Ebionite interpreters of the old law, namely Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodotion, and have also dedicated them to the churches through the labor of Origen in Hexapla. The same thing is mentioned by Jerome in the preface to Paralipomena, where he says that the Jew Aquila and the Judaizing heretics Symmachus and Theodotion were received among the Greeks. So actually, even the Greeks were using different Greek texts, not just the Septuagint, but other translations as well. Dorival says that there were several forms of the Septuagint, and the New Testament writers quote the Septuagint. They often make use of translations which are different to those of the Old Greek. Sometimes these are quotations from one of the Jewish revisions. Like Irenaeus or Justin Martyr abundantly quotes the Old Testament. Because he lived in many places, his biblical text is expected to be eclectic. And according to Steve, this is the case. He remarks that Justin's quotations of the minor prophets evoke Symmachus. So, as you can see, it wasn't just the Septuagint that was used. So this further complicates the argument that based on the Septuagint, the North African councils were making these decisions. That has to be proven. We have Cyril of Alexandria, who quoted Ezekiel both from Theodotion but also from the Septuagint. So quotations, I don't think, lead anywhere. It's not enough to go by quotations. As we have seen, it's understandable that fathers will quote or prefer the Greek Esdras because it's a better translation. Still, they used also other translations and revisions and recensions. So let's look now at the lists, the so-called canonical lists. Now, I'm going to focus mainly on lists that compare the Hebrew ordering of the books and the Christian ordering, because this will give us an idea what do they think about the books of Esdras. One exception will be Augustine, who is not comparing his canon to the Hebrews, but still it will be very significant. So first, Bryennius list. Now, the Bryennius list, we don't know who compiled it. Some would say it comes from the 2nd century, some that from the 4th century or 5th century. What is significant is the title of the Bryennius list. It says names of the books among the Hebrews. So clearly the author of this list tries to reconstruct what the Hebrews accept. Now, was the compiler a Christian? Could be. Does this mean that he himself accepted this canon? That has to be proven. That cannot be argued just based on this list. I mean, he can be compiling this list because he wants to know what the Hebrews use in order to evangelize them. That makes sense. So even if Gallagher and Mead argue that this was compiled by a Christian, that doesn't prove that this Christian himself accepted this canon. Nevertheless, notice there's Esdras A and Esdras B, so 2 books of Esdras. So does this mean that the Hebrews accepted the Greek Esdras? No. I think he simply designates the Christian rendering and compares it to the Hebrew. So what he's saying that these 2 books, which the Christians recognize, is one among the Hebrews. And this is the same thing what Origen does. So he says, but it should be known that there are 22 encovenanted books according to the Hebrew tradition. Esdras 1st and 2nd in one, Ezra, that is the helper. Ellis says, Origen's 2 books of Esdras refer in all likelihood not to the 2 Septuagint books of those names, but to the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, books that were one in the Hebrew Bible, but were separate in some Septuagint codices of that period. This is what Lange says. The 2 books of Esdras, which are in one, refer to Ezra and Nehemiah, as the Septuagint book of 3rd Esdras overlaps too much with Ezra and Nehemiah to be counted as one book in 2 parts. Otherwise, 1 Samuel to 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles also would have been counted by Origen as one book. Yeah, that makes sense because these books run parallel. So the 2 books of Chronicles is a retelling of these 4 books. That is why I don't accept the argument that what Origen is making is saying that the content of these 2 books is found in one book among the Hebrews. No, because then this argument doesn't stand, because then he would combine, as Lange says, 1 Samuel to 2 Kings and 1st, 2nd Chronicles into one. And besides, Jerome says that the texts are joined together. So he's talking about the text, not the content. So clearly, Ezra A and Esdras B from the large codices are not meant by Origen here. And this is what Gallagher says. The books Origen has in mind under the titles Esdras A and Esdras B are perhaps the books known by those names in the LXX tradition. So he refers to large codices, which English-speaking scholars customarily call First Esdras and Ezra Nehemiah. The other possibility is that Esdras A refers to Ezra and Esdras B refers to Nehemiah, in which case Origen's comment that the Hebrews reckon both books together would be more accurate. Yes, I agree. Ezra and Nehemiah do count as one book in the Jewish Bible, but First Esdras is not part of the Jewish Bible. A fact that Origen presumably would have known from his hexapla. Yes, that's the point. Origen was familiar with the Hebrew text. He knew Hebrew. He compiled his hexapla, which included both the Hebrew and the Greek. So he certainly knew that the combined book of Ezra and Nehemiah is the Hebrew version of the Greek Esdras and Nehemiah. Okay, he certainly didn't have in mind the two books of Esdras from the large codices. It doesn't make sense at all. Cyril of Jerusalem, again, among the Hebrews, in like manner, the first and second of Esdras are counted as one. In what manner? In the same manner as first and second Kings are one, third and fourth are one, and in like manner, first and second Chronicles are one. The same way, first and second Esdras are one. Again. Now, Gallagher and Mead argue that in one instance, Cyril quotes a passage from Greek Esdras and introduces with the words Ezra says. Therefore, Cyril means Esdras A and Esdras B from the large codices. Now, why? I mean, how about Cyril recognizing first Esdras as Ezra or Greek Esdras as two variants of the same book, and second Esdras as Nehemiah, just as in the Hexapla, which is based on the Septuagint. Athanasius of Alexandria. Among the Hebrews, then, Ezra, the first and second, likewise as one. Same thing. Now we have a Coptic fragment of the Festal letter, and it attributes the words of Nehemiah to Esdras. Therefore, Ernest argues that Athanasius had in mind Esdras A and Esdras B from the large codices, but again, this is wrong. I mean, again, the same thing. The first book of Esdras can be either Greek Esdras or Ezra, because these are two variants or two translations of the same book. Second Esdras is Nehemiah. Makes perfect sense. Epiphanes of Salamis. For they, the Jews, have 22 names of letters. The first of Esdras is joined to the second and becomes one book. And again, now two other remained, which are of Esdras 2 reckoned as one. Hilary talks about the Old Testament and the 22 books, of course, according to the Hebrews. He says, 2 of Paralipomenon are in the 10th, so 2 in 1. Words of the days of Esdras in the 11th, so again, 2 in 1. Rufinus. Then 4 books of Reigns reckoned by the Jews as 2. Paralipomenon, otherwise called the Book of Days. 2 books of Esdras, which among them are counted as 1. Over and over again, the same thing. Now again, Gallagher and Mead speculates whether Rufinus means Esdras A and Esdras B or Ezra and Nehemiah. I don't think so. It's certainly Ezra and Nehemiah or Esdras and Nehemiah. And now Augustine, very interesting. So he's not comparing his list to the Hebrews, but he says this. And the two of Ezra, which last look more like a sequel to the continuous regular history, which terminates with the books of Kings and Chronicles. So the two books of Ezra is a sequel to the continuous regular history, which terminates with the books of Kings and Chronicles. Continuous history, keep that in mind. When it comes to the books of Kings and Chronicles, he says this: these last, which means the two of Chronicles, not following one another, but running parallel, so to speak, and going over the same ground. So the four books of Kings is running parallel with the two of Chronicles. So the two books of Chronicles are retelling the same story as the four book of Kings. So Augustine specifies when the two books are doing this, are telling the same story. But notice, if Augustine had in mind Esdras A and Esdras B, he would use the very same description, that Esdras B or Esdras A is a retelling of Esdras B, or vice versa. But that's not what he's saying. Augustine says that first and second Esdras are a continuous history. So that would be Ezra and Nehemiah, or Esdras and Nehemiah. Now, usually this is brought up very often as evidence that Augustine accepted Esdras, and particularly because he quotes the extra canonical book of the three bodyguards as prophecy. Now, scholarship is more careful. Scholars usually say that it's a potential prophecy. Now, I want to show you this. Nisi forte, what does it mean? Let's look at the actual English translation. After these three prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, during the same period of the liberation of the people from the Babylonian servitude, Esdras also wrote, who is historical rather than prophetical, as is also the book called Esther, which is found to relate for the praise of God events not far from those times, unless perhaps Esdras is to be understood as prophesying of Christ. And then he goes on quoting the story of the three bodyguards. This is in the Civitate Dei, the city of God. So unless perhaps Esdras is to be understood as prophesying of Christ. Does this mean Augustine viewed it as prophecy? No, he says simply that by some it perhaps could be understood as prophecy. It's a general term, unless it is to be understood. But he's not saying he understands it that way. In fact, he could have been much clearer. He could have said it is a prophecy, but he seems to hesitate to say so. In fact, this is what Michael F. Bird says. Augustine knows full well that First Esdras is a historical work and not prophetic book, and there is no question as to whether or not this was the intended point of Zerubbabel's speech in the text of First Esdras. It clearly was not. So, Augustine already told you that it's not a prophetic book. And would he consider Greek Esdras canonical? I would argue yes, as a variant of Ezra, sure. But did he intend to accept the extra material? Well, I don't know. Okay, he's very hesitant to see this as a prophecy. Question is whether because he probably was hesitant to accept this extra material. I don't know. That has to be proven. We cannot arrive any other conclusion than he's making a general term that it might be understood as a prophecy, but did he himself understand it? I don't think so. And let me show you an example from Jerome. Jerome says in his commentary on Hosea, whence also in the book of Shepherd of Hermas, if anyone wishes to accept its reading, the church is first seen with a gray head, then as a young woman, and the spouse adorned with her hair. Now, did Jerome himself accept Shepherd of Hermas? Well, we cannot say based on this text. It's just, he says, if one wishes to accept it, same way when Augustine says, if this text is to be understood as prophecy, in general terms, he's not saying I am accepting it, or I view it as a prophecy, or it's definitely a prophecy. And look at this. This is what Scheck says about this quotation from Hermas by Jerome. The most probable explanation is that Jerome did not himself read the Shepherd, and that he criticized it severely under Origen's influence. So actually, Jerome did not accept this book, but it might seem as if he accepted it. So we have to be careful arriving at conclusions which the text is not indicating. Now, did Augustine use the Septuagint only? He certainly was an ardent defender of it, but he used also other works. This is what Gallagher says. Comparison of different translations could often relieve the obscurity, as Augustine discussed with regard to Isaiah, for which he cited both the Septuagint and Jerome's translation of Isaiah, without actually mentioning Jerome or acknowledging that it was a translation from Hebrew. In these cases, he resolved the difference by interpreting the translations together, declaring them mutually illuminating. And of course, Augustine would also read Daniel in Theodotion and not in the Septuagint form. So in the City of God, he also makes he also says that both the Hebrew and the Septuagint are basically divine. Here's an article by Gallagher. As opposed to the majority of church fathers who preceded him, Augustine does not think that the 70 translators accurately rendered the Hebrew foliage in every passage. Both the Septuagint and the Hebrew text evidence the altitudo prophetica. They are both authoritative, since both are one and both divine. That is what Augustine says in Civitate Dei, and that's what the Latin text says. So some might be shocked by Augustine saying this, but that's actually the truth. Moreover, you might be shocked by Jerome as well, because in his letter to Augustine, he says that it's, however, more keeping with your enlightened judgment to grant to all others the liberty which you tolerate in yourself, for in my attempt to translate into Latin, for the benefit of those who speak the same language with myself, the corrected Greek version of the scriptures, I have labored not to supersede what has been long esteemed, but only to bring prominently forward those things which have been either omitted or tampered with by the Jews. So Jerome actually says that the Jews corrupted the text. And yeah, that's a logical conclusion. In Isaiah, he translates the prophecy about Christ, right? That virgin shall bear a child, not young woman, as according to the Hebrew. So he would go with the Septuagint. So, and therefore, Augustine eventually accepted Jerome's view. Gallagher says, it is this last point Augustine later says has convinced him of the utility of Jerome's translation. And like Bonadier claims, Augustine accepts both variants without sacrificing that of the Septuagint, but not without admiring that it is best supplemented by the Hebrew variant. But did actually Augustine change his position also on the canon? Clearly he accepted both the Hebrew and the Septuagint, Did this affect his opinion on the canon? Well, actually it didn't. As Marin notes, the position adopted by Augustine now in the final years of his life regarding the canonicity of wisdom may be significant in the context. In the letter that Hilary of Marseille sent to Augustine in 427 CE, informing him of the criticism that the Augustinian theology of predestination had aroused in the ascetic circles of Marseille, Hilary pointed out that one of the passages invoked by Augustine to demonstrate the gratuity of the gift of perseverance in faith until the hour of death, quoting Wisdom 4:11, was rejected by Massilians as non-canonical. Massilians were some heterodox group, apparently, and they rejected the wisdom, but Augustine offered a pushback. Marin goes on. In the work that Augustine produces in response to the Provençal critics, Augustine reaffirmed his position on the interpretation of the aforementioned passage of wisdom, at the same time while still noting that the canonicity of this book was evidenced by its traditional public reading in the churches. So Augustine did not certainly change his mind on the Deuterocanon. He accepted it until his death, and he based his whole theology of predestination on it, which by the way is quite different from the Calvinistic notion of predestination. Just a side note here. This is what Augustine says. Since this is so, the statement from the Book of Wisdom ought not to have been rejected, for that book has merited to be proclaimed by the rank of lectors in the Church of Christ for so many years, and merited to be heard by all Christians, from bishops to the least of the lay believers, penitents, and catechumens, with veneration for the authority of God, cum veneratione divine auctoritatis audiri. So clearly, wisdom is a divine book. It's the book of God, of God's word. Now, last list is Jerome's list. We have already seen his prologue to the book of Esdras, where he says that his book of Esdras combines Ezra and Nehemiah. The texts are joined into one book. And he confirms this also in his prologue to the book of Kings. He says, eighth is Ezra, which is also in the same manner among Greeks and Latins divided into two books. In what manner? In the same manner as first and second Paralipomenon. Okay? So clearly he uses the word divido, which means divide, separate. It doesn't mean that he uses two different versions, but divides the text into two. Okay. So the East and West, they both have two books instead of one, which corresponds to the Hebrew. And this is also repeated in Epistle 53. The 12 prophets whose writings are compressed, coartati, within the narrow limits of a single volume, Ezra and Nehemiah, that is the Lord's helper, and his consoler are united in a single book, artantur. So he uses the same word with the minor prophets, just as with Ezra and Nehemiah. What does he tell about the minor prophets? That the minor prophets are compressed in one. Not that there are more versions of minor prophets. No, the Hebrews have them in one book. Same way Ezra and Nehemiah is in one book. Now Bogat makes the claim that, well, Jerome cites the Greek Esdras in his commentary to Ezekiel. Therefore, he accepted it. Well, first of all, I looked into the critical edition, and it should be lines 84 to 85. Jerome quoting the Greek Esdras, but in the apparatus, I don't see it. In 84, 85, I have Ezra 41, right? But I don't see chapter 5 and verse 64-65. So here Jerome talks about the lamentations would be greater than the sound of trumpets, which does correspond to the Greek Esdras. But if you compare it with the Hebrew Ezra, it is also very similar. The Hebrew Ezra also talks about the trumpets, and that the people could not distinguish the trumpets from the lamentations. So I don't see this to be a decisive argument. Moreover, Jerome quotes the Septuagint frequently. In his commentary to the Minor Prophets, he says, I have briefly spoken in the preface so that setting forth the words of Malachi, first according to the Hebrew truth, then according to the interpreters of the Septuagint, supported by the help of your prayers, I might explain what follows. Jerome numerous quotes or comments on the Septuagint numerous times. It's not unique to him. And of course, if Esdras was in the Septuagint as first Esdras and Nehemiah as second Esdras, it would make perfect sense. I don't see a problem here. Gallagher says, Jerome surely does not intend to include first Esdras in the canon here, meaning in his list. He never translated first Esdras. He perhaps regarded it as a variant edition of Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, the only point I disagree is that it's a variant of Ezra and Nehemiah. I think it's just a variant of Ezra, because Nehemiah is just 5%. So, but I explained it before. And the last thing about Jerome, it's significant that he even translated the editions from the book of Daniel. He also translated the editions from the book of Esther. In regards to Baruch, he at least mentions and explains why he's not translating it. But when it comes to the additions to the book of Esdras, the story of the three bodyguards, he's not making any explanation. No excuses. He omits the book altogether, and he simply translates Ezra and Nehemiah. But he doesn't explain why he omits the story of the three bodyguards. So I think it was really just seen as a variant of Ezra. So here's the summary of the list. As you can see, it's always coherently as first and second Esdras as one book among the Hebrews. I think clearly the church fathers regarded Greek Esdras as a variant of Ezra, as first Esdras, and Nehemiah second Esdras. Therefore, they can claim that the Hebrews have first and second in one. But you cannot claim it if you follow the enumeration from the large codices. That doesn't make sense. So far we showed that manuscripts are not consistent on the naming convention. That was the first video. And now we have seen the quotations are not consistently from the Septuagint. Of course, mostly the Greek Esdras is preferred, but that is understandable due to the linguistic features. But only until the 5th century, and after the 5th century, there's a rapid drop in the Latin West, which is very important. Certainly, it's not due to the influence of Jerome. And Jerome did not feel the need to translate even the Greek Esdras nor the additions, the extra canonical material. And the list consistently present the two books of Esdras as the same as the one book of Hebrew Ezra. Therefore, Greek Esdras was a variant of Ezra, which was first Esdras, and second Esdras is Nehemiah. Thank you for watching, and see you with part 3 next time. Bye-bye.